Pandemics and highly contagious diseases are nothing new. Book of Leviticus, our first reading today, could have been written relatively recently. If we just replace leprosy and we call it COVID, some of the recommendations are fairly similar. A person must shield his upper lip and then cry, "Unclean, unclean." We've seen the requirements of face masks and the isolation that has been placed upon people who haven't had COVID, and that says nothing of the isolation that's been placed upon people who have had COVID over the last 12 months. Humanity knows what this has felt like right throughout history. Jesus understands this as well. It's quite fascinating what happens in this gospel today. A man with leprosy, a disease that was not able to be cured at the time. There was no great miracle cures, there were no great hospitals, and there was no great vaccines. If you got leprosy, you were on a path towards death. And it meant, from the book of Leviticus, and even at the time of Jesus, and that's the book of Leviticus, it's about 4,000 years ago. The Gospel's about 2,000 years ago. People were told to live outside of society, to live away. And they had to call unclean, unclean. They weren't allowed to touch somebody. They weren't allowed to come close to someone. Here in Australia, and I'm sure it's happened in other parts of the world as well, that they're very big on contact tracing. We've been doing this, and we've been doing it even as we come into the church this morning. Just as a little brief announcement, the government's actually required us all now to use the QR code, and if we can't use the QR code to enter, we have to then, after Mass, enter it into the computer system so that they have the contact details for everybody. So if you're able to use your phone, please use it to check in. It just saves me or somebody else having to fill all the data in after Mass. Contact tracing is an interesting thing. At the time of Jesus, they were sort of following, okay, who did these people meet? And the Jewish understanding was as if someone who was unclean, someone who had leprosy, came into contact with somebody else, that other person was then considered unclean. And they had to then go to the priest at the temple and get a full clean bill of health before they could actually re-enter into society. And what Jesus does is very interesting. We're told that Jesus sees this man with leprosy. Jesus immediately has compassion for him. You have this man who comes pleading, probably at a distance from Jesus. He's on his knees, asking Jesus, "Please cure me." And Jesus comes over, and we're told that Jesus touches him. This is an incredible thing. This would have made Jesus technically unclean. Jesus technically probably should have gone and then got a clean bill of health from the health officials to say that he was good. But Jesus has compassion. He reaches out and touches the man. And Mark tells us, I think, a really interesting piece of information. I don't know how they know this absolutely, but we're told that the leprosy left the man immediately. So did Jesus actually touch a man who had leprosy or didn't he have leprosy? This is the debate that was going on. The leprosy leaves him immediately, and the man is cured. Jesus understands what we've been going through. He understands the isolation. He understands the pain. And he has compassion. And he's the one we can turn to at all times when we are isolated, when we feel like we can't get out, when we feel perhaps we are unclean, we turn to Jesus. In a couple of days' time, this coming Wednesday, we begin this season, the holy season of Lent, 40 days of preparation for Easter. The word quarantine comes from the word quaranta, which is 40, meaning actually a 40-day period. And quarantine and Lent went hand in hand. Last year during Lent, we went into lockdown in the lead up to Easter, and it continued into the Easter season. But it's not just about medical health that we worry about with quarantine. As Christians, we are worrying about our hearts as well, that our hearts are pure, that our hearts are ready to receive Jesus. And the man who had leprosy in this gospel, he'd been isolated. He had been, you could say, in quarantine. He had physical issues, medical problems, but his heart was ready for healing. And Jesus saw that, and Jesus took compassion. The challenge for us as we enter into Lent in just a few days' time is our heart ready to be healed? Do we know there's a problem? We know there's a problem medically. Everybody tells it. You just have to go into any public building and we know that this is still a pandemic. But what about inside our own hearts? No one's going to go and say to us what our sins are. That's for us to work out. And each of us have to work that out. To really be open to receiving the healing of Jesus, first of all, we need to know that we are sinners, that we are broken. So in a few days' time, on this Wednesday coming, Ash Wednesday, we begin this season of Lent. Start to prepare and think in the next couple of days, what are you going to do during Lent? You might give up some things. It's often what people do. And we do that so it creates space in our lives to focus on Jesus. Some people take things up during Lent. More prayer, more reflection, reading the scriptures, participating in more spiritual activities. Again, so we can be more attuned to that healing power of God. Not just for our health, but for our spirit. Let's enter into the period, you could say, of quarantine of Lent. Hopefully this year, none of us will have to quarantine or isolate from each other during Lent. But hopefully all of us will realise that we're ready for healing. We're ready for Jesus to come again into our life. And then we're ready to enter into the resurrection once we get to the Easter season. Jesus sees, Jesus touches, Jesus has compassion. And he does that for the leper in our gospel, but he does that for us as well. Let us know that we need Jesus again and be ready for this season of Lent that starts in just a couple of days.